Good afternoon. I'm Bill Hamblet, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings, here in the broadcast studio of the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center at the U.S. Naval Institute. It's July 18th, and we just completed the August issue of Proceedings today, our annual Coast Guard-focused issue. So look for that in your mailboxes on the first of the month or online. The online version will be up on the 31st of July. Before I introduce our guests today, I want to highlight a couple things that are coming up here for the Institute. First, our essay contest. It's that time of the year for the annual Marine Corps essay contest. The deadline is coming up soon, 31 August. Top prize of $5,000. So if you're interested in the Marine Corps, you got an idea about how to make the Marine Corps better, how to tackle some of the questions that have been raised in Force Design 2030, please enter that one. And our annual fiction essay contest, which is co-sponsored with SimSec, has a top prize of $500, a deadline of mid-September. And that one is open to military fiction writers. And we've been getting some great content out of that contest the last couple of years. All our essay contests are judged in the blind, so a true meritocracy of ideas. And to find out more, just go to our home site, usni.org/essay-contests, usni.org/essay-contests. All right, so now I'll introduce our guests. The winner of the 2018 General Prize Essay Contest was a young man named Hunter Stiers. He wrote an article titled "The South China Sea Needs a Coin Toss," which we published in the May 2019 issue. Coin meaning counter-insurgency, of course. Hunter followed that article with several more on the topic of free seas, China's illegal activities in the South China Sea, and how the U.S. and our allies could push back. And last year, he brought us a proposal to do a full project on maritime counterinsurgency, including he had enlisted a group of really exceptional authors, many of them who'd already written for Proceedings in the past and will continue to do so. So fast forward to now, the Maritime COIN Project kicked off in the July issue, and Hunter Stiers is with us on the show today. Hunter, welcome to the Proceedings podcast.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. Our other guest today, joining us from Rhode Island, is Professor Jim Holmes, the J.C. Wiley Chair of Strategy at the U.S. Naval War College. Jim is a former Navy surface warfare officer, a longtime Proceedings author on the show. His article, "You Have to Be There," is the lead article in the Maritime COIN package in the July Proceedings. Jim Holmes, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Bill. It's always a treat to be with the Naval Institute.
Thanks for being with us. All right, so I'm going to ask a few questions, and then I expect we'll probably get some that will pop in from the audience. So first question goes to Hunter. Just for our listeners maybe who aren't aware or haven't been paying real close attention to what's happening in the South China Sea, describe for us what China is up to, the illegal activities in the South China Sea.
Thanks, Bill. I think that's a really important issue and a terrific topic to start us off. Certainly, when we think about China, we generally, a lot of the attention and a lot of the headlines focuses on the development of their high-end warfighting capabilities. We hear a lot about the expansion of the People's Liberation Army Navy. We hear about the expansion of their anti-access and area denial weaponry. What we don't hear nearly enough about, and which is, I think, really the focus of both the project and really, I would argue, China's decisive line of effort in the South China Sea, is its forcible coercion of local civilian mariners in Southeast Asia. Fully half the world's fishing fleet operates in the South China Sea. More than 3.7 million people depend on access to this body of water for their daily livelihoods, and this really large civilian population is being subjected to a really concerted campaign of intimidation and harassment. We see Chinese maritime law enforcement, China Coast Guard, Chinese maritime militia. These guys, they go and they steal fishermen's catch. They will confiscate radios and navigational equipment that is essential to safe operations, especially by small craft out in this pretty expansive waterway. We see Chinese forces will, for example, they will pour gasoline in Vietnamese fishing vessels, supplies of drinking water to force them to go back to shore. We see, for at least 10 years, Chinese forces had a regularized system of kidnapping Vietnamese fishermen for ransom, really exorbitant ransoms equivalent to 8 times their annual income. And as if all of this isn't bad enough, you see Chinese forces ram and sink people too. And perhaps worst of all, they leave people in the water to drown, just in total contravention of the fundamental law among mariners that essentially that you share the water space, you try not to hurt people, and when someone is in trouble, you help them. And we are seeing this just completely. I write about it in the introduction to the project. It is this outrageous desecration of the most foundational law governing conduct among mariners, and really just how we relate to each other as people. So, and essentially, looking at this and what they are trying to do, and you look at essentially China's pretty outlandish claim to in quote unquote indisputable sovereignty over 90% of the South China Sea. Essentially, they're claiming this huge patch of ocean, using this term that they refer to as blue national soil. And I think that phrase is really instructive. They're claiming it like land. They are basically advancing this principle that, in contravention to the well understood law of the sea, as we have kind of developed it and come to understand it, and China was an integral part in negotiating the codification of customary international law into the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This principle of the freedom of the sea, which is that nobody owns the ocean, and that whatever states do get in terms of sovereign rights is based on what they own on land. And China is basically saying, no, that's not the law anymore. What we say goes, and what we say is we own all of this, and we're going to claim it like land. And we get to decide who gets to go there. And so essentially, if you look at what the definition of this is, I mean, really what we're talking about is essentially this cumulative, and Professor Holmes can talk about this, better than I can. He is the J.C. Wiley Chair and the J.C. Wiley Professor of Maritime Strategy at the War College. This gets into really J.C. Wiley's discussion of cumulative versus sequential campaigns. And what China is waging is a cumulative campaign of coercion to essentially impose a new set of laws and a new set of political authority on this civilian maritime population, while simultaneously declining a conventional force and force decisive battle against the military defenders of the established political order, namely us and our friends and our allies. And so if we look at this is really essentially the essential definition of an insurgency. So they are waging a maritime insurgency. They call it themselves People's War at Sea, which is this Maoist term that we generally refer to as insurgency, in this case at sea. And so they're working to do this without rising above to the threshold that would generally trigger a major conventional armed response by the United States and its allies. So they're really kind of synthesizing their two key players in their strategic canon of Sun Tzu, who advances the notion that the height of skill in strategy is to win without fighting. And they are synthesizing that with Mao, who is kind of the most successful insurgent in history and wrote the book that everybody uses on how to wage an insurgency. They're synthesizing these two approaches and they're applying them to the maritime domain.
Got it. Well, that's a great answer, and I think you really summed it up very well. And for our listeners, if you go and find Hunter's introduction to this project in the July issue, it's also as tight and succinctly put. So in response to that problem set, that coercion, that intimidation, those illegal activities of what China's up to try to take over, to bully its way to supremacy in the South China Sea, we've launched this Maritime Counter-Insurgency Project. So tell our listeners, just 30,000-foot perspective, what's in the project and kind of where is it going?
Well, thank you, Bill. In terms of the purpose of the project, the idea here is to really get the preeminent minds in maritime strategy in the world to begin thinking through this project, and we've done that. I mean, the launch package in the July issue here is. We've got Dr. Holmes leading off the project, followed by Jeffrey Till, who my very first day coming to work at the Naval War College as a researcher for Dr. Holmes in 2015, I walk into the front office of the strategy and policy department, and they're like, "Here, read this," and it's Professor Till's book on Sea Power Guide to the 21st Century. So he has this phenomenal article called "At War with the Lights Off." Then we've got Brian Clark, who's the person that the Navy turns to whenever they're trying to figure out what their future fleet design is. They turn to Brian Clark, and he has a really interesting perspective about essentially taking on this notion that we need to be focusing only on the highest end, worst possible case scenario, high end fight. He says, actually, no, we should be basically essentially accepting the logic of nuclear deterrence at the high end and calibrating our conventional forces to be prepared to respond to all of the myriad other more likely and less risky ways that China might try to achieve its objectives, both in Taiwan, in the South China Sea, and in other theaters. And he has some fascinating recommendations there that are very much worth people's time. We've got Gary Lehman and Greg Lewis, who are two fantastic minds. Gary Lehman is one of the key minds behind expeditionary advanced base operations and stand-in forces, and these key concepts that are guiding the Marine Corps towards this Force Design 2030 that General Berger has outlined as part of his vision for where the Marine Corps needs to go. And they examine what is the Marine Corps' role in this, and these evolving Marine Corps concepts. The commandant talks about, look, I don't want to have to fight the next fight, and that we need to be thinking about how do we compete, how do we deter, and it's not, EABO is not this break glass in case of war only. This is much more about how can we be there day to day? How can we support our allies and partners? And so they really do, in their article, I think that they do a terrific job of really fleshing out what does that mean? What does that look like? Then we've got Captain Brent Sadler, U.S. Navy retired, who is a Southeast Asia focused foreign area officer with a lot of experience in the Pacific and in global force management and in operational planning, and bringing also, connecting the military to the political, diplomatic elements of national power. And so he takes this really interesting look, in his article, Win the Contest for a Rules-Based Maritime Order. He is looking in depth at the impact of really his discussion is excellent of the prototype implementation of maritime counterinsurgency, which is the Task Force 76's successful response to the West Capella incident, and understanding how can we calibrate a maritime counterinsurgency campaign to most effectively support our allies and partners. And then we have Major Brian Kerr, U.S. Marine Corps, who has this phenomenal short story. What I love about Brian's work, both in this and other short stories that he's written, is he is so effective at communicating the kind of the day-to-day reality and the flavor of the life on the ground, on the deck plates. And so here he is envisioning, what does a future maritime counterinsurgency operation look like? And so you have this Mark 7 patrol boat, so some future small combatant with a combined Navy and Marine Corps crew. You've got embarked U.S. Coast Guard, embarked Philippines Coast Guard. They're working with the Philippines Coast Guard and Philippines Navy, and they are operating from a forward expeditionary advanced base in Palawan. And then we see both in the online version specifically, that includes kind of the opening where you see what does this look like on a day-to-day level, and what does the standard form of operations look like. You're working with a Philippines Coast Guard vessel to go and interdict illegal Chinese fishing vessels and enforce Philippine laws in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And then we envision how the Chinese, you might wind up in a situation where the Chinese try to set a trap for these guys, and they try to escalate both against the civilians and then basically set a trap for the Americans and their embarked Filipino partners. So really interesting and just a gripping piece of writing. And then looking downfield, we have some absolutely phenomenal thinkers who are coming down the pike. I mean, we've got in the August issue, we've got Captain Josh Taylor, who is has a campaign plan for maritime counterinsurgency. Coming up, we've got Captain Peter Schwartz. I mean, the architect of the 1980s maritime strategy, and also a really important inspiration for the project, and in terms of its design, because a lot of at least my own thinking as we were kind of putting this together, and was essentially how, Bill, as I'm sure you recall, was how can we do something along the lines, similar to the seminal January 1986 issue of Proceedings on the maritime strategy, and certainly different because that was an official Navy product. This is being done by these experts who are from throughout the naval ecosystem. It's phenomenal, the diversity of thought, really. So that's sort of a broad gist of kind of and we got plenty more coming down the pike as well. Beyond that, I'm so excited to have these these just incredible minds.
Yeah, it's a great project with really top-notch authors, and as you point out, many of them have already written for Proceedings and will continue. And we plan at some point, maybe later this fall, hopefully no later than winter time, having a maritime security dialogue kind of panel discussion with some of the initial authors, as we've done with the American Sea Power Project, as we these ongoing things like last week. Ward Carroll interviewed the leaders of naval aviation in a maritime sea power dialogue that we had here at the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center. So we'll do something like that for this Maritime COIN project. So excited about that, and then we'll see where this goes. But the conversation is off to a great start, and as some have already noted, it's been picked up not insubstantially by press, particularly in Asia right now. South China Morning Post, the China Times, Taiwan. So a couple of different outlets over in Asia have noticed this project and started talking about it. So we hope that continues. So the next question, I want to go to Jim, and this back out to grand strategy and what the nation is facing right now. So there's a lot of problems. Turn on NPR, turn on Bloomberg, turn on your favorite news story, whatever it is, Fox News or New York Times, the war in Ukraine, hyperinflation, some might say, the Southwest border problem that the United States faces. There's a lot of problems facing this nation at this time. So some might say, South China Sea, why do I care? That's the other side of the planet. The Chinese are harassing some local fishermen in the South China Sea. Why is that a problem for Joe Sixpack, for the United States of America?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think possibly the way to look. I mean, first of all, when you look at strategy, what is it? It's basically a process of setting and enforcing priorities. You're never going to have enough resources, enough intellectual bandwidth, and so forth to do everything that the nation wants. We have a lot of priorities, and we just don't have enough. No nation has enough resources to accomplish everything it wants to do, no matter how worthwhile some of those things may be. I think possibly the way to put it to the American people is to point out that what is happening in the South China Sea directly impacts on a lot of those other problems, especially economic problems. What we're talking about, if we let China get away with what it is trying to do, Hunter mentioned the standard talking point out of Beijing that China wields indisputable sovereignty over 90% of the South China Sea. It's basically claiming the South China Sea as land territory. Beijing will make the laws and regulations and so forth that govern what goes on in that body of water if it gets its way. That is where we are talking about letting the international system, as we've known it since 1945, as founded with the United Nations at San Francisco, at Bretton Woods, and all those sorts of things. You're essentially talking about letting a major principle of international law go, and I think that you're talking about undercutting the foundation of the international system. Think about what the United States strategy has been since the days of Theodore Roosevelt and Alfred Thayer Mahan, Henry Cabot Lodge, all the big minds of the late 19th and early 20th century. U.S. maritime strategy in particular, has always been predicated on access, commercial, military, and diplomatic access to places we would like to trade, chiefly in East Asia and Western Europe. If you start letting coastal states like China or Russia or Iran or whoever essentially assign themselves jurisdiction, sovereignty over these bodies of water, whereby they may forbid or permit or whatever shipping to go into those bodies of water, you're talking about letting those states strike at the nature of the commercial system and thus strike directly at American prosperity. And without prosperity, we're not going to accomplish a whole lot. So I think that's the way to put to the American people. This is a goal of surpassing importance And if we get this right, if we can prevent China from actually getting its way, making itself sovereign, essentially declaring state ownership over a major body of water, if we can do that, we set a good precedent. And ultimately, I think we've set ourselves up to start resolving some of these other, especially the economic problems that you mentioned, whether it's the supply chain problems we've seen in the last couple of years or whatever. But yeah, without access to the rimlands of Western Europe, East Asia, South Asia, we're not going to accomplish a whole lot in the world, and we're going to be a lot poorer for it. So this is a top priority.
That's a great answer. I would add, not to answer my own question, but I'm going to do that. I would
That's what
add,
you're supposed to do. Yeah.
I'd add two things, which is one, Hunter mentioned blue territory, that the Chinese are looking at the South China Sea as their own sovereign territory, which is not at all different than the way the Russians are looking at Ukraine, right? It's land versus water, but it's the same thing. It is a territorial expansion, an illegal seizure of territory. And the other thing I would add is also the fact that I probably shouldn't do the math in my head, but a number of U.S. treaty allies ring the South China Sea, right? So starting with the Philippines, Japan being very close by, Australia being very close by, Thailand being a treaty ally as well, and so we're talking about nations who we have defense priorities with, commitments to, and their sovereignty is being impinged on illegally by China. And so to let that go, to just back away from those commitments would be, to your point, Jim, setting a very bad precedent. So
yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we have no strategic position in the Far East without our alliances. If we start betraying our commitments to our alliances, we're basically just shrugging and turning our backs on everything we've done for the last 80 years or thereabouts. That's a major decision. And if the American people want that, our leaders in Washington D.C. should at least put it to them in those terms. This is not a small strategic decision we're talking about. It's a major one. It's of the utmost magnitude.
Yeah, amen. So Hunter, I'm going to next question back to you. There's been a lot of attention in proceedings about the Chinese naval buildup, the PLA Navy. They're on their third aircraft carrier now. They've been, launching warships into the sea like dumplings into the soup, right? They are on a massive building campaign to build a world-class Navy. And yet this insurgency that they're carrying out it involves the Navy kind of tangentially, but the main forces are really not the PLA Navy. So describe the forces that the Vietnamese fishing vessel or the Philippine fishing vessel sees that is the real problem here. How is this instantiated on the ground or on the water in the South China Sea by the Chinese?
Sure, I think this. So it's been described by in a couple of different ways, and you look at people like Ryan Martinson and Andrew Erickson. They've done a lot of really terrific work on this. Dr. Holmes is, probably definitely a better qualified interlocutor on this particular point. But the gist of it is that they are essentially using this. It's been described as a cabbage strategy, and I really like Dr. Holmes's term of it's small stick diplomacy. Instead of leading with the Navy, as we might be accustomed to in managing an international dispute, the Chinese are the leading edge, are not the high-end war fighting assets. They are the maritime militia, which are armed fishing boats. Some of them are actual fishers, and others are professional militiamen in boats that are meant kind of dressed up to look like fishing boats. And then you've got the China Coast Guard, and it's the China Coast Guard is very interesting in the sense that it is, and this was a point that was made at we had the Center for Regular Warfare and Armed Groups at the Naval War College held a very interesting symposium a few weeks ago, and some senior Coast Guard officers who have extensive experience operating in the region were talking about how really the China Coast Guard is not a Coast Guard in any really recognizable sense that as we have come to expect of a Coast Guard in the modern world. They are not going and enforcing the laws among Chinese mariners. They are there really to coerce other people. They are not there to help aid other mariners who are in distress. They are there really to put mariners in distress. They are really one of the primary sources of danger rather than safety and rescue, as a Coast Guard is supposed to do. Coast Guards are supposed to help people, and the China Coast Guard, you see them right. We were talking about earlier. They're stealing people's cash. They are ramming people. They're sinking, driving over and sinking people, firing on unarmed civilians. And there was an example of a Vietnamese vessel that was surrounded by China Coast Guard vessels, and it sank. And the China Coast Guard claims ludicrously that the Vietnamese boat sank itself to make the China Coast Guard look bad. I don't, and hopefully no one believes that. No one should believe it, because the China Coast Guard really, and this was a comment I made to Zhao Shanzhu of Voice of America as she was covering the project launch, that the China Coast Guard is not a Coast Guard in any recognizable sense. These are seagoing thugs and gangsters dressed up as Coast Guardsmen, and they are not performing the functions of a Coast Guard.
Hey, Hunter, I want to interject a question from the audience. So Robert Elliott asks, how does this stuff get documented? So in other words, when the China Coast Guard acts like thugs instead of acting like a Coast Guard, how does that get reported either up the chain of command to their national authorities or to us? How does the world find out what China's doing?
Well, this is a great question, and I think this leads to a much deserved shout out, especially to the Philippines press. These reporters are getting out on the water. They go out on a fishing boat, or they go out on, they charter some other boat, and they are the ones who are recording and they are capturing what is happening firsthand. And that is a critical way that we know we have learned of a lot of these incidents. Another really good, excellent source, you look at the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. So they published a terrific study by, I believe it was Elena Bernini a few years ago, that was looking in depth at Chinese practices of kidnapping Vietnamese fishermen for ransom. And you can find it on their website. And again, really powerful stuff, especially there are moments when it is inconvenient for certain governments to highlight this issue, because again, they understand they have to live with China on, they're not going away. So there are times where they are trying to moderate, the nationalist sentiment of some of their populations. So sometimes they are not necessarily playing this up. There was an example of this, in the Philippines, when there was a Chinese maritime militia boat that backed over a Filipino fishing boat in the middle of the night and drives away, leaving everyone in the water to drown. The only reason no one dies is there was a Vietnamese fishing boat nearby that several hours later sees these people in the water and, in accordance with its international obligations, comes to their aid. And the Duterte, this created a major political crisis in the Philippines. And the Duterte government was trying to find a way to put the kibosh on this and keep it on a little bit of a down low, because they at the time they had this policy of trying to be more friendly to China. One of the things I think is really interesting, speaking of that kind of that previous policy, was and Brent Sadler talks about this in his article for the launch for the launch package in July, is we have seen the impact of essentially this prototype maritime counterinsurgency effort around this incident with the West Capella in 2020, when so this Malaysian chartered survey ship is undertaking a survey in the Malaysian exclusive economic zone, and in contrast with previous U.S. practice of essentially we'll take a ship and we'll drive through and then we'll sail away. Task Force 76 under the command of Rear Admiral Fred Kacher and 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Bill Mers, they make this really concerted effort to show that we show support for Malaysia in its in undertaking and exercising its rights under the system of international law that we want to see enforced. So they make this concerted effort to demonstrate a persistent U.S. presence in the vicinity, both with capital ships, and then when the capital ships, of course, they're busy, they have to sail away eventually. Then they follow that up with these lighter warships. They have 2 littoral combat ships with Destroyer Squadron 7 based at Singapore at the time, and so they construct this persistent U.S. presence, and where I think we've been really worried that the Malaysians were going to abandon what they were doing, they stick it out, and they finish the work that they came there to do. And then you see, and Brent and Captain Sadler talks about this in his article, we see following this, there's initially some consternation as to, are the Americans just doing the same old playbook again? But we didn't. And this playbook, we ran a new play.
Yeah.
And then over the next year, you see 3 major regional powers change their stance, including the Philippines, which does a complete 180. And when the Chinese Maritime Militia shows up at Whitsun Reef, they send out the Philippines Coast Guard and they start taking pictures. Again, another really good source of information about the Maritime Militia has been the operations of the Philippines Coast Guard at that time. And Ryan Martins and Andrew Erickson did some terrific work following up on that based on the stuff that they were publishing about the Maritime Militia.
Those are good examples. I want to get to Jim again for a minute and talk a little bit about his article, You Have to Be There. So there's 2 questions from listeners. The first one, T.S. Scott Me, says, I'm not hearing any solution to China's crimes. And so, Hunter, I think you just touched on some of that. And then there was another question from Robert Elliott, which was, should we ratify UNCLOS? And I think those are kind of connected here. But I throw both of those to you, Jim, to describe a little bit about your article, because I think you really kind of get to the crux of this matter. You have to be there. And you use an analogy of a beat cop. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Thanks, Hunter. Yeah, to take the last one first, I mean, yes. The answer is probably yes. We should formally join the UNCLOS regime. As our listeners and watchers have undoubtedly know, the United States has accepted UNCLOS as customary international law for many years, right, since the 1980s. So we do agree on the principles underlying the law of the sea. However, when you're in an international environment, that's a very difficult thing. That's a very difficult thing to tell people, because it requires a lot of legal argumentation. At that point, China can a Chinese representative can throw out a one-liner and say, "Oh, these guys are trying to enforce what they don't even believe in." At that point, you're sort of back on your heels and so forth. So again, I don't think we're in a bad legal situation. I do think the politics of it does not work against the United States simply because of that fact. So so I think the answer is yes. I think that just sets us up better in international forums to go out and defend the law of the sea, defend the international legal order of the sea as we've known it since 1945. To go back to the more specifics on what I had to say. What I had to say is blindingly simple. I mean, if you ask Admiral Wiley, who Hunter mentioned a few minutes ago, wrote a wonderful book in the 1960s called Military Strategy. He observes that what he calls the man on the scene with a gun. This is the arbiter of who wins an international conflict. And what he's talking about essentially is putting the ability to put superior combat power on scenes of action at the right place at the right time, in order to either defeat your adversary if you're in an open war, or to deter or to coerce that adversary if you're in peacetime strategic competition, such as we are in the gray zone in Southeast Asia. So it's all about amassing combat power where it's needed, when it's needed, and keeping it there until the dispute is actually settled. I think that's one place that we have really fallen short in the South China Sea, in other bodies of water potentially around the world. Whether it's pick your map and look around the boundaries of Eurasia, whether it's the East China Sea, Black Sea, Baltic Sea, Arctic Ocean, or whatever. We have to be present on the scene and stay there in order to get our way. Otherwise, if you think about what we do in the South China Sea, what do we do? Basically 2 things. One, we show up and do freedom of navigation cruises, which we've been doing quite a bit for the last couple of years. Those are wonderful. Those are great statements of legal purpose, and they defy China's claims to indisputable sovereignty. And sometimes, as we just have also recently, we'll send a carrier task force or a surface action group or whatever into the region to perform maneuvers. But what do? We always show up and we go away. If China is there 24/7, 365, and we're there just on occasion, look at the situation through the eyes of a Vietnamese or a Philippine fisherman or a Malaysian fisherman. That's the person we're trying to embolden. If China holds the field almost all of the time, and the United States shows up and mounts a show of force once in a while, who are you actually going to try to satisfy? Who's going to do the coercing and the deterrence? I would say it's China, just because they are there.
Yeah, great point. Robert Elliott also says a bunch of the articles in this package hammer the need for allies too. And so, Jim, to your point a second ago, if China's there on the field all the time and we show up sort of intermittently, come and go, it's a home game for them, right? It's a far away game for the United States. So how do we balance that? Because we're a global power. We're looking to project naval power around the world. And so we've got, commitments in Fifth Fleet, commitments in Pacific Fleet, in the Atlantic, to NATO, et cetera, with a Navy of 300 ships, plus or minus, on a good day. So the point about the need for allies is really critical here. So what are the chances, do you think, of getting the Australians, the French, the Brits, the Japanese to play in this game with us and our allies to help embolden those Vietnamese, those Filipino, Malaysian fishermen, et cetera? How's that going?
I actually feel pretty good about the situation compared to, especially to a few years ago. The basic point is that we cannot want to defend navigational rights or rights under the law of the sea for a coastal state more than that coastal state wants it itself. It's Hunter mentioned President Duterte. I think we're headed into another uncertain era with the new President Marcos. An offshoot of the Marcos regime, which we had a painful experience in the 1980s. So so there's a diplomatic angle. I think we need to convince these allies that they have to want this. We can't want it more than they do. We can only help them help themselves. If they want to defend their navigational rights, their rights to fish and do all those things that you can do in your exclusive economic zone, I think ultimately we'll be okay. I've been very heartened, however. Furthermore, I should say, by the willingness of Japan to get involved, by the willingness of Australia to take an active hand in the region. India, we shouldn't forget the Quad. The Quad, this emerging, not an alliance, but a coalition to offset China's pretensions at sea. There are a fair amount of good things that are happening now. We pay a lot of attention to weapon systems and all that kind of stuff, and I think there's good things happening there as well. But I actually think simply because of China's behavior, I don't think anybody actually has any illusions about China anymore. And that's a real glue that could help bind together a coalition that will offset China's pretensions. So if we can hold the line, and there's a lot of bad economic news coming out of China these days. If China's actually at a turning point in which its fortunes economically, diplomatically, politically, militarily are starting to turn down. If we can hold the line for long enough, I think we might actually see this wave of Chinese, what we call it assertiveness, I would call it aggression, might start actually to recede.
So we are kind of bumping up on our time limit here. Hunter, I'm going to give you a minute just to talk force structure, because in any conversation like this, people start to wonder, what should our Navy look like, right? What do we need to build? And you mentioned Brian Clark is one of the gurus when the Navy questions what its force structure should be. One of the people they always ask is retired Commander Brian Clark, and he's written for Proceedings a number of times. He's terrific, been on some of our panel discussions as well. And his article in this Maritime COIN package touches on that. But just talk briefly, if you would, about some of the things that Brian talks about in his article, and then on my to-do list is to try to get Brian scheduled for an upcoming episode of the podcast where we can delve into that a little bit more.
Absolutely. And I think that the themes that Brian hits are themes that are really, they apply very broadly across the work of the project. And we see, Dr. Holmes, talks about, the gist of what we need to do. Jeffrey Till on, from almost an operational standpoint, and then the force structure element. Brian Clark handles that very well and then how that fit, and then Brent Sadler talks about how this fits into this broader political diplomatic strategy. And then Brian Kirk talks about what that looks like on the deck plates. The work of that launch package, it really hangs together in an exceptional way, and the forthcoming articles are really going to add to that. And I think the key theme here is that you have to, and I think Josh Taylor puts it really well, which is that you have to combine the current model of periodic high-end presence with a persistent low-end presence. These things go together. So in Dr. Holmes's article, I really like the point that he makes about how the British used to do it, where you have these lower-end forces that are more numerous and more persistent on station. Maybe a couple of frigates or colonial gunboats that the British still had wooden gunboats on these distant stations, even in the age of armored cruisers. They had value because if you messed with that wooden gunboat, maybe you could take it on. But if you mess with a gunboat, you're getting the armored cruiser, which is steaming over the horizon, doing those higher end, more warfighting focused missions. And so, look at the Anglo-Zanzibar incident, shortest war in history. So they messed with the gunboat, they got a squadron of armored cruisers. Obviously, that was a much more colonial situation. It's grossly unequal for sure, but that same logic applies when you're dealing with a great power. You look at, and I think Jeffrey Till talks about this also, again, from a tactical operational art kind of standpoint, which is that the most successful counterinsurgency, the folks who are trying to defend the political level, trying to defend the established status quo, the most successful counterinsurgents are those that start to adopt the tactics and methods in some respects of their insurgent opponents, and then they use their superior resources to beat them at their own game. So the Sri Lankan Navy is instructive. They, when they started out the Tamil conflict, they were getting beat. They had these kind of big and ungainly patrol boats that were getting ambushed and really chewed up by the Tamil Tigers. And then Professor Till describes how the Sri Lankan Navy adapts, and they adopt the tactics and some of the force structure of the insurgency, smaller, more nimble, more maneuverable gunboats and patrol craft, rather than these heavier, more ponderous vessels. And they then use that and they turn that around. They beat the insurgents at their own game. And I think
great point. Yeah, we're running out of time here, but I'd fast forward to a couple things. As a Navy guy, I have admired some of the platforms that the U.S. Coast Guard is building right now, right? And I've advocated sometimes to folks that the fast response cutters, the national security cutters, even the offshore patrol cutters that the Coast Guard is building, upgun them a little bit and buy some for the Navy. And I think that's a touch on the kind of, as you said, the low end force structure that you need there for every day, with the the DDGs and the carrier strike groups coming through periodically, right? So unfortunately, we're out of time. This has been a great conversation. This is a really terrific series of articles in the July issue, and as Hunter, you said, we've got some more to come playing out in we got Josh Taylor's article in the August issue, which is a campaign plan. Like, how would you put together a campaign plan? And I tease it up in my editor's page by saying it's one of those rare things in the good idea category. It's something you could actually implement quickly. So great talking to you, Hunter. Professor Holmes, Jim Holmes, great to have you on the show again. Always good to talk to you. And I'm sorry that we're out of time, but that wraps up another episode of the Proceedings podcast. I want to thank our producer, Heather Legg, who was the person who put together that great intro that we're now using. So I'm really excited about that. The show is brought to you by the members of the Naval Institute. Since 1873, our members have been the foundation of everything we do at the Naval Institute. To become a member, go to usni.org/join. And until next week, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.